Welcome, traveler. You've found your way once again to the quiet halls of the sleepy historian, where time slows, armor gathers dust, and the stories of the past unfold like parchment in candlelight. This is boring history for sleep, gentle storytelling for weary minds, soft-spoken history meant not to stir the heart, but to calm it, to help you drift toward dreams. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's strangely comforting, isn't it, to imagine others scattered across the world, all falling asleep to the same quiet rhythm of history, knights, castles, and the slow turning of forgotten centuries. Tonight's story drifts through a quieter age of chivalry, the time between wars. We often imagine knights as men forever in shining armor, charging across battlefields, banners fluttering in the wind. But most of their lives were not spent in war. They were long days of waiting, of training, of managing estates, of prayers whispered in stone chapels, of idle gossip in drafty great halls. This, then, is the story of how knights spent their days when not at war, the rhythms of peace that shaped the world between battles. So dim the lights. Let the world grow softer around you. You might imagine yourself within the thick stone walls of a medieval keep, the air faintly cool, smelling of wood smoke and wax. A tapestry sways slightly in the draft. A candle guttering on the table sends a wavering glow across worn wooden planks. Outside, the sound of a horse in its stall, a slow, rhythmic snort. Somewhere above, a guard's footsteps echo faintly along the parapet. And deep in the hall, perhaps, a knight sits quietly by the fire. No sword in hand tonight. Only thought, reflection, and the long patience of peacetime. This episode unfolds in 4 parts. First, we'll explore the daily life of a knight, the quiet routines, the meals, the rituals, and the rhythm of days in a medieval castle. Then, we'll wander through the story of one particular knight, tracing the contours of his peaceful years and the lessons they left behind. Next, we'll journey into the realm of mystery and culture, the forgotten customs, tournaments, and the subtle art of chivalry. And finally, we'll visit the contrast between noble and common lives, discovering how peace was experienced differently across the medieval world. This is not a story of war, but of waiting. Not the clash of steel, but the hum of bees near a moat. Not the cry of victory, but the sound of a whetstone gliding slowly across a blade, preparing for a battle that might never come. So breathe softly. Let the centuries unfold around you. And together, we'll wander through a world both distant and familiar, calm, deliberate, and beautifully slow. Welcome, once again, to Boring History for Sleep. Welcome to the quiet days of the night. The morning in a medieval castle began not with alarm bells, but with quiet stirrings, the faint sound of footsteps in the corridor, the muted crackle of the hearth coming back to life, and the low voices of servants preparing for the day. Imagine yourself in such a place, where light entered not through glass, but through narrow slits in the stone, cutting slender ribbons of dawn across the chamber's chill air. The night's day began early, though seldom in haste. He would rise from a heavy bed draped in furs, the air around him cool and still. A servant or squire might have already brought a basin of water, cold and faintly metallic from the bucket's rim. There were no mirrors as we know them, only polished metal or still water to catch a reflection. The ritual of washing was brief but deliberate, a gesture of both cleanliness and discipline. Before the day's business began, there was prayer. In the quiet of a private chapel or before a crucifix in the chamber, the knight might murmur his devotions, a moment to seek guidance, to steady his thoughts, and to give shape to the coming hours. The rhythm of his life was bound to faith, and in times of peace, that faith filled the spaces where battle once loomed. Breakfast was a modest affair. Bread, perhaps still warm from the ovens below, a wedge of cheese, a sip of watered wine or weak ale. Sometimes a few slices of cold meat from the previous night's feast. The hall was still dim then, lit by the pale orange of dawn filtering through the high windows. The smell of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of beeswax candles lingered from the night before. As he ate, the knight might listen to the steward's quiet recitation of estate matters, the yield from the fields, disputes among tenants, repairs needed on the stable roof. These were not glamorous concerns, but they shaped his daily life as surely as sword practice once did. The management of land was a knight's true test in peacetime, ensuring that the people who lived under his protection could till, sow, and harvest without fear. When the sun had fully risen, the courtyard would come alive with motion. The clang of a hammer at the forge, the neigh of horses, the chatter of servants carrying buckets and baskets. The knight's morning training soon followed. Not the brutal exertion of war, but a controlled practice meant to keep the body supple and the mind disciplined. Sword drills, mounted exercises, or perhaps a round of archery on the green. The sound of leather creaking, the thud of hooves, and the faint ring of steel filled the crisp morning air. Between these moments of motion were long pauses, the essence of medieval time. There were no clocks striking the hour, no schedules as we know them. The pace of life was dictated by the light and the seasons. A knight in peacetime learned patience as much as skill. His mornings were not battles to win, but rituals to maintain. Occasionally, a visitor might arrive, a neighboring lord, a messenger bearing a seal, or a monk seeking safe lodging. These encounters broke the monotony, adding threads of conversation about distant events, trade, or royal decrees. Yet even then, the castle's calm persisted. News traveled slowly. A story might be days old, its urgency already fading into rumor by the time it reached the great hall. The knight, though trained for war, found meaning in this steadiness. His armor hung ready on its stand, polished and silent, a reminder of what might come again. But for now, the sound of life was gentler. The scraping of chairs, the shuffle of boots on stone, the faint whistle of a stable hand at work. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the world waking around him, the rhythm of medieval peace. The lowing of cattle beyond the walls, the creak of a drawbridge as it lowers for the day, the murmuring of the household beginning another quiet cycle of existence. By mid-morning, sunlight would reach deeper into the courtyard. The knight, having trained, prayed, and eaten, would turn to the management of his lands, walking through barns, inspecting tools, or speaking with the reeve about the tenant's needs. Even in his authority, there was a sense of order and humility. The feudal bond was one of duty, not just privilege. This, then, was the morning world of knight not at war, a place of stone and ritual, of steady footsteps and soft voices, where each act, washing, praying, eating, training, echoed through quiet halls like verses in a slow, endless song. It was a life shaped by discipline, yes, but also by patience, the art of waiting with purpose. So, as the castle fully wakes, the rhythm of its life continues, unhurried, familiar, and constant. The kind of rhythm that has lulled centuries to rest, and perhaps will lull you too. As the morning ripened into midday, the castle's hum softened into steadiness. The early rush of chores had faded. The clang of the forge grew rhythmic, less hurried, like a heartbeat settling after exertion. The sun stood higher now, washing the gray stones of the keep in a pale, golden light. You can almost imagine the warmth spreading across the courtyard walls, the faint shimmer of dust rising from the worn flagstones, the scent of hay drifting in from the outer yard. For a night, these hours were not idle, or might have been distant, but duty was not. His world was one of stewardship, the patient care of lands, people, and property. Each responsibility tied him to the soil more than to the sword. He would move through the estate with quiet purpose, often accompanied by a steward or reeve. The reeve, a trusted man, usually chosen from among the peasants, kept detailed records of rents, yields, and livestock. The knight would inspect the barns, perhaps running a gloved hand across the rough wood of a door, noting where it needed repair. Chickens scattered at his approach, and the smell of straw and earth hung thick in the air. At the mill, He might watch the slow turn of the great wooden wheel, water glinting as it spilled from its paddles. The sound of grinding stone was steady, almost meditative, a reminder that while war was fleeting, grain and bread were eternal. Such sights connected the knight to the deeper rhythm of his world, the quiet labor of others that sustained the grandeur of his class. Afterward came the review of accounts. In a small chamber off the great hall, parchment and ink awaited. The steward read figures aloud. Rents collected, debts owed, payments for repairs. The knight, though not always literate, understood the flow of value, the delicate balance between generosity and order that kept his household strong. Coins clinked softly into wooden chests. Wax seals were pressed on folded messages bound for merchants or other lords. It was the business of peace, and though it lacked the glory of victory, it demanded its own kind of courage, patience, fairness, and restraint. By midday, the castle kitchens were alive again. The smell of roasting meat and freshly baked bread mingled with smoke from the hearth. Servants moved steadily, ladling soup, carrying trays, slicing apples. The noon meal, the dinner of the day, was the largest. It gathered not only the household, but sometimes guests, squires, and visiting clerics. Picture the great hall now, the long tables set with trenchers of bread, pewter cups glinting in the flicker of torchlight, even though the sun still shone outside. Conversation was low and measured. There was laughter, but not in bursts, only the gentle kind that rippled and faded quickly. The knight sat at the high table, his sword resting beside him not as a symbol of threat, but of place. Grace was said before and after the meal. You might listen to a visiting monk read a passage from a chronicle, or hear a minstrel sing softly in the corner. The music was simple, the gentle plucking of strings, the slow melody of an old tale, something about honor, about patience, about the cycles of time. After the meal, the castle settled into a hush. The midday sun was bright but still, and life within the walls slowed. Some servants dozed in shaded corners. The knight might retire to his solar, a private upper room warmed by sunlight filtering through thin linen drapes. There he might remove his gloves, rest his hands on the table, and read or be read to. Books were precious things, handwritten and illuminated, often in Latin or French. A scribe or cleric might sit nearby, quietly turning pages, the faint crackle of parchment joining the soft hum of bees from outside. Sometimes the knight wrote letters to other nobles, to the local monastery, or to his lord. His words were few but formal, inked carefully by a clerk. These letters carried not emotion but duty, reports, agreements, or matters of allegiance. Later, he might step onto the battlements, overlooking the lands that stretched outward in calm repetition. Fields, meadows, and distant cottages, all shimmering in the sun. Farmers moved like slow figures in a painted scene, bent to their work, steady and enduring. The knight would stand there for a time, saying little, perhaps feeling a rare peace. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his household functioned smoothly, that his people were fed, that the roofs held firm against rain and the walls stood strong. It was a satisfaction built not from triumph, but from balance, a life kept steady between the demands of duty and the stillness of waiting. This midday rhythm was the heart of peace for the medieval knight, a life measured by tasks rather than glory. Each motion, the inspection of a barn, the signing of a document, the sharing of a meal, carried its own weight of meaning. These small actions kept the world turning when swords slept in their scabbards. Outside, a soft wind moved through the trees beyond the moat. The banners on the walls fluttered gently, the sound faint but constant, like the slow breath of the castle itself. And in that stillness, in the spaces between sound and silence, you might feel the same drowsy calm that settled over those stone walls centuries ago. This was not a life of excitement, and that was its quiet beauty. A life of small duties, soft sounds, and patient time, each hour folding into the next, like the turning of a page in an endless medieval day. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, The castle's world shifted again. Its sounds softened, its shadows lengthened. The rhythm of the day began to slow, as if the stones themselves exhaled after long hours of quiet labor. The warmth of midday faded from the walls, replaced by the cool, faintly scented breath of evening. In these hours, the night's duties gave way to gentler pursuits. The hall that had buzzed with midday chatter now settled into a murmur. Torches were lit, their flames wavering and small. The flicker of firelight played along the carvings of beams and the glimmering edges of metal plates stacked neatly on shelves. The smell of smoke, of wax, and faint traces of roasted meat filled the air, mingling with the soft, almost musical clatter of cups being set down and distant laughter carried through the corridors. For a night in peacetime, evening was the hour of community and reflection, the time when discipline yielded to companionship. Some evenings brought guests, a traveling minstrel, a messenger delayed by weather, a neighboring lord seeking conversation. Others were quiet affairs, shared only with family, squires, and the trusted few of the household. After vespers, the evening prayers, supper was served. It was simpler than the day's main meal, a stew of vegetables, perhaps fish, bread, and a little ale. The knight's place at the table was the same, but the mood was softer now. Servants moved slowly, voices hushed. The glow of the hearth bathed faces in a soft amber light. Beyond the walls, the world darkened. The moat reflected the last traces of twilight. Once the meal was done, and the prayers of thanksgiving quietly spoken, the hall became a place of stories. A minstrel might strum a lute and sing of distant kings, of dragons slain and maidens rescued. Those such tales for the night were memories of youth more than dreams. Sometimes a squire would read aloud from a chronicle or a psalter, the cadence of the Latin words soothing even to those who did not understand them. It was less about the story itself than about the comfort of rhythm, the gentle repetition that echoed the beating of the heart. At times, the knight might play chess or tables, games of patience and thought. The click of the wooden pieces on the board provided its own small music, a reminder that life's battles could be fought in silence and strategy, as well as in war. Conversation was unhurried, meandering through topics of harvests, the health of horses, the behavior of hawks. Outside, the night grew deeper. The sounds of the courtyard faded. No more hammering, no calls of merchants or squires. Only the occasional bark of a dog or the call of an owl across the moat disturbed the stillness. The torches along the battlements swayed in the evening breeze, their light forming shifting patterns on the stone below. In his private chamber, the knight might spend time with his family. Children played near the hearth, their laughter subdued. A lady embroidered by the window, her hands moving steadily, the soft rasp of thread through fabric marking time. There was tenderness in these moments, though it was rarely spoken. Affection in the medieval world was quiet, shown through presence rather than words. Later still, as the household began to fade into sleep, the knight might withdraw to his chapel once more. There, in the small pool of light cast by a single candle, he knelt to give thanks. The room was cool, the stone floor uneven under his knees. The faint smell of incense lingered from earlier prayers. He prayed for peace, for health, for wisdom to rule justly, and perhaps silently for the strength to bear the weight of stillness that came with peace. For even in calm times, the knight's mind was restless. The habits of war did not fade easily. In the silence of evening, thoughts of the past might return. Campaigns long ended, comrades lost, banners burned and remade. Yet even these memories, softened by time and repetition, became part of the lullaby of his nights. They were no longer sharp or haunting. They were familiar, dulled like the edge of a sword kept in storage too long. Before rest, he might look once more from the window, the night air cold and fragrant with the scent of damp earth and smoke. The sky above was vast and silent, the stars clear and steady. Below, the land slept, the fields, the cottages, the winding river glinting faintly beneath the moon. It was a view that reminded him not of power, but of stewardship, of the fragile thread connecting his life to all those who worked beneath his protection. Finally, when the candles burned low, he lay down again upon his bed of furs and linen. The sound of the hall faded, the last crackle of fire softening into a steady hush. Perhaps he could still hear a squire murmuring a prayer in the next room, or the distant hoot of an owl beyond the walls. Then even those sounds would blend into silence, a silence deep enough to cradle the weary mind. In this stillness, the castle slept, its walls, heavy with centuries, held within them not just armor and banners, but dreams, slow, ancient dreams of men who waited, worked, and rested between wars. The kind of peace that feels endless, the kind that lets the heart quiet itself completely. And so, another day of waiting closed, quietly, evenly, as it had opened. A day among 1,000, and yet entirely its own. The rhythm of medieval peace continued, steady and eternal, carrying both knight and listener toward the gentlest kind of sleep. Among the knights of medieval Europe, few left as deep a mark as Sir William Marshall, often called the greatest knight who ever lived. His story, though filled with battles and tournaments, also reveals something quieter, the long, contemplative years between wars. It is in these still moments of his life that we see the rhythm of peace, the gentler weight of knighthood carried with grace. Imagine, then, not the clang of steel, but the sound of rain against castle stone. William is no longer a young squire chasing renown. He is a man seasoned by decades of service, his hair silvered, his steps slower but firm. The world outside his window has changed. Kings have risen and fallen, yet within the walls of his estate, the pace of life has steadied into something enduring. Born in 1146, William Marshall served 4 English kings, Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, John, and Henry III. His youth was marked by the trials of war, but his later years unfolded in quieter halls, where diplomacy, loyalty, and governance became his armor. He had once been a tournament champion, riding beneath fluttering banners, but now, in his 50s and 60s, he ruled lands, not battlefields. On peaceful mornings at his manor of Caversham or his estates in Normandy, he would rise to find the household already awake, the sound of servants at work, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. The smell of baking bread drifted through the open shutters. The world beyond the walls was calm, and his life now revolved around maintaining that calm. He would walk slowly through his lands, accompanied by his retainers, speaking with tenants, hearing petitions, and resolving disputes. His presence was both reassuring and commanding. When peasants saw the old knight approach, they bowed not out of fear, but of gratitude. For William Marshall had become known as a fair lord, one who remembered the hardships of lesser men. After years of bloodshed and peril, peace had become his truest test. Managing his estates required judgment, patience, and the art of listening. The clatter of armor had been replaced by the murmur of conversation, the scratch of quills, the shuffle of parchment. He spent long hours with his stewards discussing grain yields, taxes, and the well-being of his people. The life of a knight, he had learned, was not just measured in victories, but in endurance, in holding steady the fragile balance between power and responsibility. During the midday hours, guests often arrived. Clergy, neighboring nobles, or even envoys from the king's court. His hall echoed with discussions of law, of inheritance, of the shifting loyalties of England's lords. Yet even amid these talks, his demeanor remained calm, his voice steady, his patience legendary. He was known to weigh every word before speaking, as if each carried the weight of an oath. The afternoons of William Marshall's later life often found him in quiet reflection. He would retire to his chapel, where the cool air smelled faintly of stone and wax. There, kneeling before the altar, he prayed not for glory but for forgiveness, for peace in his heart and peace in the land. He had seen too much to crave conquest. What he sought instead was harmony between faith and duty, between loyalty and rest. Outside, the world turned with a gentle rhythm. Horses grazed in distant meadows, their tails swishing lazily. The hum of insects mingled with the far-off voices of children at play. The sun fell across the fields in long, soft lines. It was a world that seemed timeless, though William knew that time was catching up to him. In the evenings, he often sat by the fire, speaking quietly with his wife, Isabel de Clare, heiress of vast lands, and his steadfast companion. Together they had built a family, 5 sons and 5 daughters, and through them, the Marshall legacy would endure. Their conversations were not of war, but of home, of their children's futures, of the harvest, of the state of the kingdom. There was comfort in such talk, the comfort of shared endurance. Yet even in peace, his duties remained heavy. When King John's reign grew turbulent, William's loyalty was tested once again. Though he disagreed with the king's cruelty and rashness, he held firm to his oath. "I will not forsake the man I have sworn to serve," he once said quietly, a statement of faith not in the man, but in the promise itself. It was this constancy that defined his later years. As the sun set on his life, William Marshall became the protector of young King Henry III. In his 70s, weary and worn, he served as regent of England, guiding the kingdom with patience and restraint, seeking reconciliation where others sought revenge. It was perhaps his greatest service of all, not fighting for a crown, but preserving it. And yet, even in the midst of counsel and responsibility, he found moments of stillness. Those who saw him in his later years often remarked on his serenity, the calm that came not from comfort, but from having faced every storm and survived. His peace was earned. As night descended over his estate and the fires burned low, William Marshall's world was one of quiet dignity. His armor, once bright, was now ceremonial, resting untouched except on holy days. His sword, once lifted in countless battles, hung on the wall, a relic of another life. He no longer sought the sound of trumpets or the clash of lances. The rhythm of his life was now the slow turning of seasons, the whisper of prayers, the soft closing of doors as the household settled into rest. In the twilight of his years, Sir William Marshall showed that the truest form of knighthood was not found in war, but in peace, in governance, mercy, and the steadfast keeping of faith. His story, like the evening light that fills the castle windows, reminds us that even the greatest warriors must one day learn the art of stillness. As the years drifted onward, the life of Sir William Marshall began to resemble the quiet rhythm of the tides, steady, measured, inevitable. He had known the fury of war and the triumph of knighthood, yet in the soft decline of age, he found his truest calling, to guide rather than to conquer, to preserve rather than to destroy. When the winter of his life arrived, he was well past 70, an age few knights reached in those turbulent centuries. His hair had turned to silver, and the strength in his arms had faded, yet his mind remained clear, sharp as ever, and his spirit unwavering. Those who came to see him in his later years often remarked on his calmness, that gentle authority that made people lower their voices when they entered his presence. At this stage, William Marshall was no longer simply a knight or a lord. He had become a living memory of an entire age. Younger men would look upon him with awe, whispering tales of his legendary duels, of kings he had served, of oaths he had never broken. Yet William himself rarely spoke of such things. When asked about his victories, he would only smile faintly and say, "I have seen enough glory to last several lifetimes." His duties as regent for the young king, Henry III, were weighty, but he bore them with patience. He understood the fragility of kingdoms, having seen too many crumble from pride and ambition. In the council chambers of Westminster, he listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was slowly, deliberately, his words carrying the gravity of experience. "A realm cannot stand on anger," he once said during a heated debate, "but it may endure upon mercy." Outside the walls of government, William's daily life grew even simpler. At his estate, mornings began with the soft tolling of the chapel bell. He would rise before dawn, leaning on a polished cane, and walk the length of the courtyard. The air would be cool, The sky faintly blue, and birds stirred in the eaves of the towers. His household, though large, moved quietly out of respect. There was a solemn peace in those early hours, the peace of a man who had lived fully and who now sought only grace. After morning prayers, he spent time with his clerks and his confessor. They read aloud from sacred texts, their voices echoing softly through the hall. William listened intently, nodding, sometimes closing his eyes. He had once studied strategy and warfare. Now, he studied silence. His reflections often returned to the fragility of loyalty, the passage of time, and the strange, fleeting nature of honor. In the afternoons, he welcomed visitors, knights from his past, young nobles eager to learn from him, or even simple pilgrims who wished to see the great marshal. He greeted all with humility, offering food and a listening ear. "We serve others best," he would say, "when we remember that our own hands, too, have been held up by kindness." Those who stayed in his hall during his final years often described the strange serenity that filled the place. The banners that once fluttered in triumph now hung faded and still. The armor on the walls had lost its sheen, but none dared polish it. It was not neglect, but reverence. Even the dogs that padded across the floor seemed to move with a quiet understanding that their master's time was drawing near. When illness began to take hold, William faced it as he had faced every battle, with composure. He knew his body was failing, yet there was no fear in him. One evening, he called his family together. The hall was lit by candles, their flames trembling against the stone. His wife, Isabel, stood beside him, her face lined with both love and sorrow. Around them were their sons and daughters, their eyes glistening in the golden light. He spoke softly, his voice steady. "I have lived long enough to see peace return to our land," he said. "And though I have wielded sword and shield, I have learned that strength lies not in striking, but in enduring. What you inherit from me is not land nor title, but the duty to keep faith in your word, in your honor, and in your care for those who depend upon you." Those words, simple and unadorned, became his legacy. As his illness worsened, William withdrew from worldly affairs. He took the vows of a Templar, not for the glory of it, but for the peace it promised. It was a humble act, a final step in a life defined by humility beneath grandeur. Dressed in the simple white robe of the order, the greatest knight in England spent his last days in prayer, attended by monks and his devoted family. On the morning of his death, in May of 1219, the sun rose quietly over his chamber. The air was still. The household moved with hushed reverence. William's breathing had grown shallow. Beside him lay his sword, not in his hand, but resting within reach, not as a weapon, but as a companion. As dawn turned to gold, he opened his eyes one last time. Those present said his gaze was peaceful, as though he saw beyond the walls, perhaps to the green fields of his youth, the tournaments, the faces long gone. Then, with a faint sigh, he passed. When word spread of his death, even his rivals mourned. Bells tolled across the land. The king wept openly. Chroniclers would later write that England had lost its truest knight, one who had stood firm through every storm and who died with his honor unbroken. He was buried in the Temple Church in London, in the round nave reserved for knights of the order. His effigy lies there still, a stone figure of calm repose, hands folded around a sword, face serene, as though asleep. Visitors who stand before it often note the tranquility it radiates. Even in stone, William Marshall seems at peace. And perhaps that is his final lesson. That greatness is not a matter of power or conquest, but of steadfastness, of living well and ending well, of keeping faith when all else falters. In the hush that follows his story, we are reminded that history's most enduring figures are not only those who fought, but those who forgave, not those who ruled by fear, but those who led by quiet example. Sir William Marshall, knight, regent, and man of peace, remains, even centuries later, a symbol of the rare strength found in stillness. When the clash of swords fell silent and the banners were lowered, what filled the long, unbroken hours of a knight's mind. Behind the polished armor and ritual oaths, there existed a quieter, more complex world, a world of belief, reflection, and the slow rhythm of thought. For many knights, life away from battle was not simply rest. It was a confrontation with themselves. Imagine the knight seated in a small oratory at dawn. The air is pale and cold, and light spills through a narrow stained glass window. Dust drifts through the beam, turning the air golden. His sword rests beside him, its blade dulled from use. Before him stands a wooden cross, unadorned and plain. He kneels not in fear, but in contemplation, the same posture he might have taken before charging into war. But now his opponent is time itself, and the battlefield is within. Faith was not always simple for these men. The medieval world offered certainty and mystery in equal measure. A knight was told he fought for God and for justice, yet he saw the chaos and bloodshed that such ideals produced. It was easy to speak of divine purpose when victory came swiftly, harder when friends fell, when oaths clashed, when mercy seemed to cost more than violence. In these quiet moments, many knights wrestled with contradictions. The church preached humility, yet the code of knighthood prized honor. Confession demanded truth, yet diplomacy often required silence. Some knights reconciled these conflicts through devotion, others through resignation. But most found solace in ritual, the steady comfort of repetition, the pattern that turned confusion into calm. Every morning, before the day began, prayers were whispered in the dim light of the chapel. Psalms recited from memory echoed softly between stone walls. The sound of chanting monks drifted faintly from nearby cloisters. It was not dramatic faith, no visions, no miracles, but rather a gentle, persistent rhythm that mirrored the cycle of breathing itself. After prayers, some knights would walk through their gardens, a rare luxury of peace. The scent of herbs and the cool dampness of earth grounded them. They would pause to watch the mist lift from the hedges, or to trace a cross on their breast as the first sunlight touched the chapel roof. Small acts of reverence intertwined with the simplest moments of life. In such stillness, they reflected on mortality. Death had always been close, too close, and yet, in peace, it became less of an enemy and more of a companion. Knights kept relics not only of saints, but of those they had known. A feather from a fallen comrade's banner, a small coin given in thanks, a letter faded by time. These mementos were reminders that even in the vast silence of the world, lives could be connected through memory. The inner life of a knight was shaped as much by silence as by sound. The long stretches between campaigns could feel endless, yet they provided space to think. Many learned to read, not all, but more than one might imagine. The act of reading by candlelight, lips moving silently over the Latin words of a psalm or romance, offered a kind of stillness that no battlefield ever could. Knights often pondered the same questions that echo through human history. What is honor, truly? What endures when our deeds fade into dust? They had been told that glory was eternal, yet they could see how quickly songs forgot their subjects. A few sought comfort in the idea of divine remembrance, that even if the world forgot, God would remember. Others turned instead to earthly kindness, believing that compassion was the only legacy worth leaving. It is easy to imagine their thoughts as solemn, but they were not always so. A knight sitting by the fire might laugh quietly with an old companion, remembering foolish moments from their youth. The line between prayer and memory often blurred. Gratitude became a kind of worship. As the flames flickered, the warmth on their faces reminded them of life's fleeting gentleness, that brief, tender warmth before the night returns. Many knights kept journals or dictated reflections to scribes. Their writings, though simple, reveal minds both weary and wise. One anonymous knight wrote, "The world is a wheel that turns without pause. When I am up, I give thanks. When I'm down, I wait. It is better to move with the wheel than to stand against it." Such quiet acceptance marked the mature soul of chivalry, a philosophy not of conquest, but of endurance. Faith, for these men, was not an escape from life, but a way of living within its uncertainty. They prayed for courage, but also for rest, for strength, but also for peace. And perhaps, as they listened to the toll of the evening bell, they felt something larger than themselves. Not the voice of God in thunder, but the whisper of time, patient and vast. Even the hardest warrior could find calm in that rhythm. The steady repetition of the day, prayer, work, rest, became a lullaby of purpose. The body aged, the armor rusted, but the soul learned stillness. In that stillness, knights found meaning. They did not call enlightenment or philosophy or art. It was simply life, stripped of its clamor. A quiet faith that even the most turbulent existence could return, at last, to peace. And so the knight, who once thundered across battlefields, now sat beneath the twilight sky, watching stars appear one by one. His sword slept beside him. The wind passed gently through the grass. In the hush of that moment, there was no glory to chase, no victory to claim, only the slow, eternal rhythm of being. For the medieval knight, the world was filled with signs, gentle, constant reminders that heaven and earth were woven together. In every flicker of candlelight, in the flight of a bird, in the fall of rain upon stone, meaning could be found if one knew how to look. The age was one of faith, but also of quiet superstition, of half-understood symbols that shaped the rhythm of each day. Imagine the knight standing at the threshold of his hall before sunrise. The world still dim, a faint mist curling along the grass. He would pause and look eastward toward the light, crossing himself before stepping into the day. This act, small and habitual, was more than devotion. It was a form of protection, a ward against unseen forces. Every gesture held a purpose, every habit a whisper of belief. Knights carried charms and tokens, often hidden beneath their armor. Some wore a scrap of cloth said to have touched a saint's tomb. Others kept a small piece of parchment inscribed with a prayer or symbol, tucked inside a metal case, tied with leather, resting close to the heart. These were not ornaments of vanity, but companions of faith, talismans of reassurance when the world grew uncertain. Superstition and faith existed side by side. If a bird crossed a knight's path on the morning of a journey, he might delay departure until the next sunrise. If lightning struck too near his castle, he might order a priest to bless every doorway with holy water. The medieval mind did not see these as contradictions, but as harmony, the sacred and the mysterious blending like the notes of a slow, ancient hymn. The language of symbols surrounded them. The cross, of course, was central, but so were colors, animals, and numbers. A knight's coat of arms, painted on his shield, was not merely decoration but declaration, an emblem of lineage, loyalty, and faith. Lions stood for courage, eagles for divine strength, stars for guidance, and lilies for purity. Even the shapes, a chevron, a bend, a crosslet, carried meanings handed down like quiet codes from father to son. In these designs, history and hope intertwined. When a knight polished his shield, he wasn't just tending to metal. He was maintaining his family's story. The symbols reminded him of the virtues expected of him: bravery, loyalty, piety, and of the weight of his name. To live dishonorably would stain more than himself. It would tarnish every color and crest that marked his heritage. Even architecture carried belief. Castles were not only strongholds of stone, but sanctuaries of meaning. Windows shaped like crosses, doorways aligned with sunrise, chapels built upon ancient wells, all reflected a desire to bring order to the world, to bind mystery within the shape of walls. At night, candles flickered behind arrow slits like tiny stars, each flame a quiet prayer against the vast, uncertain dark. The natural world, too, was read like a book of omens. The knight who rode through forest paths might note the sudden cry of an owl and feel a twinge of unease. A fall of cinders from the hearth could mean a letter was coming. A rainbow after battle was taken as a divine sign of mercy. To us, these things may seem quaint or fanciful, but to the medieval mind, they were part of the same truth, that nothing in creation was without purpose. There were darker beliefs as well, soft shadows that lingered at the edge of faith, tales of restless spirits, of curses, of dreams that foretold death. Knights are not immune to such fears. Many carried small relics to ward off the evil eye, or murmured brief prayers before sleep to keep nightmares at bay. They might place a dagger under the pillow, not for defense, but as a charm, a symbolic guardian against unseen harm. These customs offered comfort in a world that could seem fragile and unpredictable. When illness swept through a household or a storm destroyed the harvest, prayer and ritual gave shape to grief. The blessing of bread, the lighting of candles, the tracing of the sign of the cross. Each gesture was a way to keep fear from hardening into despair. Even in tournaments or battle, such beliefs endured. Before mounting his horse, a knight might circle it 3 times or whisper the name of a saint for courage. Before striking the first blow, he might look briefly skyward, not seeking victory but guidance. Such rituals became part of the rhythm of existence, soothing repetitions that steadied the heart. At the heart of all these symbols lay one quiet truth. Knights lived in a world where faith and imagination were inseparable. Every corner of life was enchanted, infused with unseen meaning. And though centuries have passed, something about that worldview remains deeply human. The longing to find connection between what we can touch and what lies beyond our reach. When we walk through the ruins of their castles today, the carvings still whisper those old beliefs. A faded lion above a doorway, a weathered cross in the courtyard, moss growing over the symbols once painted bright with color. The stones seem to remember the hands that traced them, the prayers murmured beneath them, the hope that meaning, however fragile, might outlast the man who believed in it. And so, the knight's world was not just one of swords and banners, but of quiet signs and patient rituals, a world where belief, like breath, sustained the living and comforted the weary. When a knight sought rest from the noise of worldly life, it was often within the quiet walls of a monastery that he found it. The monasteries of medieval Europe were islands of stillness in a restless world, places where time seemed to slow, where bells marked the passing hours instead of swords and trumpets. Their presence shaped not only the faith of the age, but also the inner world of every knight who passed their gates. Imagine a monastery at dawn. The air is cool. The ground glistens with dew. Somewhere in the distance, a bell begins to toll, slow, resonant, and clear. Its sound rolls gently across the meadows, over the low stone walls, through open windows. Inside, monks move through the corridors in silence, their robes brushing softly against the flagstones. The smell of beeswax, parchment, and fresh bread lingers in the air. A knight arriving here would dismount at the gatehouse, his horse steaming faintly in the chill morning light. He might have come to give thanks after battle, or to seek counsel for a troubled conscience. In either case, the monastery offered something that few other places could: peace without condition. Monks welcomed him with calm courtesy. There are no questions about victory or defeat, no judgment about worldly honor. Only the quiet voice of the porter saying, "You are welcome here." Within those walls, rank and title faded. A knight sat beside peasants, travelers, and pilgrims, all sharing the same bread, the same silence. The rhythm of monastic life was one of order and contemplation. Prayers at dawn, work through the day, reading and writing in the afternoon light, prayers again at dusk. To a man accustomed to the chaos of court or campaign, this order could feel strange at first, but then deeply comforting. Each hour had its purpose, and in that purpose there was rest. The monks' devotion extended beyond prayer. They tended gardens, copied manuscripts, and healed the sick. Their patience with the soil and the page taught a different kind of strength. Not the strength to conquer, but the strength to endure. Many knights admired this quiet discipline. Some even envied it. They saw in the monks a kind of courage untested by battle, yet profound in its steadiness. A few knights, nearing the end of their lives, chose to spend their final years among the brothers. They traded their mail for simple robes, their banners for wooden crosses. The clamor of the world faded, replaced by the rhythm of chanting voices and turning pages. There, they learned that silence itself could be a form of prayer, and that humility, long overlooked, was a final kind of victory. But even for those who never took vows, the church left an indelible mark. Confession reminded them of conscience. Mass reminded them of mercy. Pilgrimage reminded them that even the greatest must walk humbly. The knights' ideals of loyalty, honor, and service all found their roots in Christian teaching, refracted through centuries of ritual and reflection. The monasteries also preserved knowledge, the wisdom of Rome, the philosophy of the ancients, the scriptures of faith. A knight who listened to a monk read aloud might hear the words of Augustine or Aristotle, not as abstract learning, but as gentle guidance for the soul. Through these readings, many discovered that wisdom was not the enemy of strength, but its companion. Beyond theology, the church shaped the very soundscape of a knight's life. Bells rang from abbeys and parish towers, marking the hours for work, for prayer, for rest. Even on the battlefield, the memory of those bells lingered, a reminder of order amidst chaos, of faith amidst fear. The visual world of faith surrounded them too. Stained glass glowed with the colors of saints and angels, casting shifting light upon stone floors. Candles flickered beneath carved crucifixes. In those quiet sanctuaries, a knight could sit for hours, watching light move across the floor, feeling time itself soften. Monastic influence extended even into chivalric codes. The idea of mercy to the fallen, protection of the weak, and restraint in victory all echoed monastic teachings. The knight was expected to be not only brave, but also compassionate, to temper might with humility. Though few lived perfectly by that ideal, it remained a compass pointing toward something nobler than conquest. The church, in turn, relied on knights to defend its lands and institutions. There was tension in that relationship, the sword and the scripture, the earthly and the divine. Yet, despite the contradictions, both worlds shared a single pursuit, order in a disordered world. And so, the knight's faith was both personal and institutional, sustained by the quiet endurance of those who prayed for him. Every monastery, every cloistered brother chanting in the dark, was part of a greater harmony that held the medieval world together. As evening fell, the knight might leave the monastery with a renewed calm. He would mount his horse once more, hearing the last toll of the bell behind him. The field stretched wide and dim before him. The air smelled faintly of rain and incense. Somewhere far off, a river glimmered beneath the setting sun. He rode away slowly, perhaps lighter in heart, perhaps simply quieter in mind. Behind him, the bell rang once more, deep, measured, and soft, echoing across the land like a prayer carried by wind. The medieval world was a web of hierarchies, a living order where each person, from the lord in his hall to the shepherd in his field, held a place within a larger design. For the knight, this order shaped every breath, every choice, and every silence between battles. To understand how he lived, one must also look at those who lived around him, the farmers, craftsmen, and servants who filled his days with quiet, necessary labor. At dawn, while the knight stirred in his chamber, wrapped in wool and linen, the world beyond his walls had already begun to move. Peasants rose before the first light, lighting hearths and tending fires that had burned through the night. The sound of wooden doors creaking open, the low murmur of voices, and the faint smell of smoke and earth, all of it blended into the symphony of a new day. From a castle's high window, a knight might look down upon the courtyard below. Servants moved like clockwork, stable hands brushing horses, scullions hauling water, cooks preparing bread for the morning meal. Every figure knew their task. The order was steady, predictable, almost soothing in its routine. Though the knight's life seemed elevated, it was deeply tied to theirs. His armor was polished by their hands, his meals prepared from their harvests, his home maintained through their quiet diligence. The strength of the noble class rested upon the endurance of the common. It was a truth few questioned, yet most understood instinctively. Beyond the walls, the fields spread outward in patient rows. Farmers bent over the soil, their movements slow and steady, guided by seasons rather than swords. To a knight, accustomed to sudden clashes of fate, the rhythm of the farmer's life might have seemed timeless. No rush for glory, no sound of trumpets, only the slow work of keeping the world alive. When not in training or counsel, a knight often rode out across these lands. The air smelled of hay and damp grass, and his horse's hooves left soft impressions on the earth. He would nod to those working the fields, men and women who rarely looked up, though they always knew when their lord passed by. Between them was respect, though often distant, shaped by duty rather than friendship. In the manor hall, life followed another rhythm. The day began with prayers, then business, petitions, disputes, and letters sealed with wax. There were ledgers to inspect, vassals to address, decisions about tithes, roads, and repairs. Beneath the grandeur of feudal rule lay constant maintenance, an unseen labor that kept the fragile balance between order and chaos. The knight's wife or the lady of the manor often oversaw the domestic realm. Her world was no less intricate, managing stores of grain, supervising servants, arranging cloth, and ensuring hospitality for travelers. The hall had to remain not only a center of power, but also a refuge of civility in a harsh world. The hum of weaving looms and the rhythm of kitchen work formed the steady heartbeat of this life. In the evenings, the great hall transformed. Torches flickered on the walls, and shadows danced across carved beams. The knight would dine with his household, a meal of roasted meat, coarse bread, and wine if fortune allowed. Conversation was slow, often formal, drifting between matters of estate, memories of hunting, and talk of distant campaigns. Yet there were lighter moments, too. A minstrel might arrive, his lute glimmering in the firelight. His song spoke of distant lands, lost loves, and heroic deeds. The knight listened, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes gazing into the flames with faraway eyes. The stories reminded him of what he was meant to be: brave, noble, and steadfast, even when the days themselves were ordinary and long. Below this world of stone and candlelight, the village slept earlier. In low cottages roofed with thatch, families gathered by the hearth. The warmth of the fire flickered over faces worn by sun and toil. They spoke quietly of weather and harvest, of small joys and shared burdens. To them, the knight's world seemed distant, gilded by rumor and reverence. Yet their own endurance, their calm acceptance of life's rhythm, was its own form of courage. On rare days, their worlds met. Perhaps during a feast, when the manor opened its gates and the villagers came bearing gifts, bread, ale, and laughter. The knight would step among them, exchanging brief words, nodding at familiar faces. For a moment, the great divide softened, and all shared the same warmth of food and fire. And when the feast ended, the peasants returned to their cottages and the knight to his hall. The laughter faded into silence, replaced by the distant sound of an owl or the whisper of wind through the trees. The same moon shone over both roofs, thatched and tiled, its light gentle and indifferent. In these contrasts, the world of the Middle Ages revealed its quiet balance. Nobility and poverty, faith and labor, rest and burden, all parts of one great tapestry. The knight, though born to rule, was bound to this rhythm no less than those who worked beneath him. And as he drifted to sleep in his chamber, perhaps he heard the faint sound of the village below, a dog barking, a cartwheel turning, a lullaby sung softly to a child. Those sounds were the heartbeat of his world, steady and unending. Tomorrow, life would repeat its gentle order: sunrise, duty, meal, and rest, the same as yesterday and the same as centuries before. The medieval year turned not by clocks or calendars, but by the changing face of the land itself. time was measured through seasons, each with its rituals, its duties, and its moods. For night, life followed this rhythm closely, tied to the same earth that fed his people and defined his purpose. Spring arrived first, gentle and damp, carrying the scent of thawing soil and distant rain. It was the season of awakening, not only for the land, but for human labor. The night's fields came alive again, plowed by teams of oxen whose slow, patient movements carved furrows in the dark soil. He would sometimes ride the boundaries of his estate, watching workers scatter seed with practiced grace. Beneath his mailed gloves, he could feel the chill of the wind softening. The air was filled with the calls of birds returning home. Within the castle walls, spring was also a time of preparation. Armor was cleaned, horses brushed, and provisions inspected. Though peace held, readiness was a constant duty. The night's household stirred with quiet activity. Repairs to the roof, fresh straw in the stables, new linens aired out under the growing sun. Even rest, in this world, was a kind of labor. By summer, the days lengthened, and the countryside shimmered with life. The knight would spend mornings on horseback, inspecting lands, settling disputes, or training his retainers in the courtyard. The clang of weapons echoed softly against the stone, then faded into the warmth of the day. His movements were measured, unhurried, the strength of his body balanced by the calm precision of long practice. Afternoons brought stillness. The heat slowed everything. Servants moved in the shaded corridors, carrying cool water or baskets of herbs. The knight might retreat to a shaded bench in the garden, where bees hummed around the flowers and distant laughter rose from the kitchens. The quiet of summer had its own serenity, a deep, drowsy calm that softened even the most disciplined minds. But summer was also the time of feasts and gatherings. Neighbors and vassals visited, bringing gifts, stories, and disputes. Beneath banners and canopies, long tables filled with bread, fruit, and roasted meat. The air smelled of smoke and honey. At such times, the knight became host, gracious, reserved, but attentive. These moments of fellowship reminded him that peace, like war, required care and vigilance. Then came autumn, the season of endings and reflection. The fields turned gold, the air crisp and cool. The harvest was a solemn celebration, filled with gratitude and exhaustion. The knight oversaw the storage of grain, the pressing of apples into cider, the salting of meat to last through winter. He would ride through the fields as wagons creaked by, offering brief words of praise to those who worked. At dusk, bonfires flickered in the distance, a sign of thanksgiving of the earth's generosity before the cold months returned. Sometimes, he joined the villagers for the evening meal. The air was rich with smoke, laughter, and the deep contentment that followed labor well done. For a moment, the boundaries between ranks seemed to blur. Under the fading sky, everyone shared in the same simple truth that life endured through cooperation, not conquest. Winter, when it came, changed everything. The fields lay silent beneath frost and snow. Days were shorter, the light pale and fleeting. The castle grew quieter, its warmth guarded by thick walls and roaring hearths. The knight's world contracted, from open fields to narrow corridors, from travel to reflection. This was the season of stories and memory. Evenings stretched long, and candles burned low. The knight would sit by the fire, listening to a reader recite tales of saints, heroes, or ancient kings. The words filled the hall like gentle waves, soothing the mind into stillness. The rhythm of storytelling, slow and deliberate, mirrored the rhythm of the passing year, calm, repetitive, inevitable. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees. Somewhere in the village, a bell tolled, marking a distant hour. The knight's horse stood in its stable, breath rising in small clouds of steam. Every living thing, it seemed, had turned inward, conserving warmth, conserving strength. And so, time passed, not as a rush, but as a cycle. Each season folded quietly into the next, repeating patterns that shaped every life. For a night, This rhythm was both a comfort and a lesson. It reminded him that his power, his land, and even his rest were all borrowed from the same turning world. When spring returned again, as it always did, he would rise once more, renewed, steady, bound to the same endless pulse of nature. The years might bring change, but the rhythm endured. In that constancy lay peace. As the years unfolded, the days of battle became memories, softened by time, blurred by repetition. For an aging knight, peace itself became the defining measure of his worth. The world outside his walls might still whisper of crusades and distant wars. Yet within his hall, life flowed with a quiet steadiness that seemed to defy time. In his youth, he had been defined by motion. The gallop of horses, the clatter of steel, the weight of armor pressing against his chest. But now, in these later years, his world had slowed. His sword hung upon the wall, its edge dulled not by neglect, but by reverence. It was a symbol of service completed, of promises kept. Morning still began with prayer. His voice, once strong and commanding, was now softer, shaped by reflection rather than duty. The chapel's chill stone held the echoes of countless years of whispered faith. Light filtered through narrow windows, dust motes swirling in its beam like quiet spirits. It was in these moments, unhurried and solitary, that he felt closest to understanding his place in the long chain of generations. Outside, the world continued as it always had. Young squires trained in the yard, their laughter mingling with the thud of wooden swords. Horses were led to the fields, banners repaired, candles made. The knight would watch from a window, his thoughts drifting between memory and observation. He had once been them, restless, ambitious, certain that every dawn would bring glory. Now, he found beauty in simplicity, the rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer, the calm repetition of a servant stacking firewood, the whisper of a breeze across the battlements. He had seen how quickly renown faded. Songs that once carried his name were now rarely sung. The minstrels preferred tales of newer heroes, younger, brighter, closer to the present. And yet, he did not resent it. History, he had come to realize, was not a stage upon which one remained forever. It was a stream, and each life a single ripple within it. As evening fell, he sometimes walked among the graves near the chapel. The air there was cool and still. Moss crept over the stones, softening the inscriptions. He would pause before familiar names, a comrade lost in youth, a brother long gone, a wife whose laughter he could still recall faintly in the silence. Each name was a memory, each memory a tether to the life he had lived. Returning to the hall, he would sit by the hearth. The firelight painted his face with warmth and shadow. Around him, the sounds of evening continued. Quiet conversation, the rustle of servants preparing for night, the occasional crackle of the fire. In that steady rhythm, he found peace. Sometimes a child would approach, a grandson or a page, asking for a story. He would smile, the lines of his face deepening with age, and he would tell them, slowly, gently, of a world that once seemed vast and perilous, of marches across foreign lands, of friendships forged in hardship, of the first time he ever saw the sea. But his words were not grand or boastful. They carried a tone of calm acceptance, a lesson hidden beneath each tale. He would end these stories the same way each time, with a reminder that courage was not always found in battle, and that honor was not only won through conquest. Sometimes it was enough to live with steadiness, to care for the land, to protect the weak, to endure with grace the long, unremarkable days of peace. When the child drifted away, drowsy from the rhythm of his voice, the knight would lean back in his chair and listen to the quiet of the night. Beyond the walls, the world slept under the same sky that had watched his youth. Stars shimmered faintly above the castle towers, unchanging, indifferent, eternal. He thought of the years behind him, of choices made, oaths sworn, lives touched in passing. And though his name might fade into the folds of history, his life had mattered, woven into the invisible fabric that bound one age to the next. In the stillness, he closed his eyes, feeling the same calm that once came only after battle. But now it was different, deeper, softer, filled with acceptance. The clamor of his youth had quieted into peace. The world, vast and unending, seemed finally at rest. And so, the knight's peaceful days became his legacy. Not the wars he fought, but the silence he learned to keep. Not the victories, but the gentle understanding that life, like the seasons, turns endlessly, beautifully, and always back toward the calm of the earth. In that eternal rhythm, he found something greater than glory. He found rest. And so, dear listener, our quiet journey through the days of the night draws to a close. The fires in the great hall have burned low, and the last candle trembles softly against the stone. Outside, the wind has quieted. The fields rest beneath the same patient moon that watched over them 1,000 years ago. We have wandered through his mornings and his nights, from the clang of training yards to the stillness of winter hearths. We have seen his armor laid aside, his duties performed with unhurried grace. We have walked among his people, shared his meals, and listened to the hush that filled his later years. In the end, the knight's life was not only about battle or bravery, but about endurance, the steady rhythm of responsibility, the calm acceptance of his place in the turning world. His days were measured by service, his peace by understanding. And perhaps, in that rhythm, there lies a quiet lesson for us too. For even now, centuries later, the same stillness remains. The sound of wind through leaves, the crackle of fire, the steady breath of those who rest. These are the same gentle notes that carried through the medieval night. The world has changed, but the calm between moments endures. If you're still awake, you might take a deep breath now, letting the air fill your lungs, just as those long-ago nights once did after a long day's labor. Imagine the coolness of stone walls, the scent of wood smoke, the faint flicker of firelight against the darkness. The world feels distant, quiet, slow, and you are part of it, resting within its steady heartbeat. If this kind of boring history for sleep helps you unwind, if these calm bedtime stories and soft-spoken history moments bring you even a little peace, you might consider liking the video and subscribing to Sleepy Historian. But only if it truly brings you rest. You can let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there, drifting into dreams with the same soft stories of the past. So dim the lights. Let the fire fade. Let the echoes of armor and hoofbeats dissolve into silence. The age of knights is long gone, but the peace they sought, the deep, unshakable stillness after duty, still lingers in the world and perhaps within you. May the turning of the seasons carry you gently toward rest. May the calm of history lull you deeper into dreams. And as you close your eyes, may the whisper of old tales, of castles, fields, and quiet hearts guide you softly into sleep. Good night from Sleepy Historian.